Today we're going to focus on this aspect of who our God is. He has provided for us. And he has provided for me. And I know we have testimonies in here across the room. If we had time, I know we can go for hours, okay, hearing from all the different ways in which God has provided for you. He's provided health. He's provided recovery. He's provided renewed relationships, right, within the family, within friends. He has provided jobs. He's provided the financial, material needs that we have, right, when we were nervous that wasn't going to happen. He has provided so much for us. He is God, our provider. There's a word for that, a Hebrew word, Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Everybody say Jehovah Jireh. Right? That's our best way in English to try to make sense of it. The word in Hebrew, it sounds a little bit more like Yireh, right? Yireh, Adonai, right? And so he is the God, our provider. I want to tell you a story about that. My wife and I, a couple Sundays ago, it was right around Valentine's Day, so I shared a story a little bit about how we God walked us through a rocky, up and down dating relationship until finally, we got things together. I got things together, and we made a commitment to each other. And so now we're working our way on going on 12 years by the grace of God. And so we were, I wanted to start with a story about our first year of marriage. We decided to get married. She was finishing up college at Cal State Northridge out in the Valley. And I had just finished up college, and I was getting ready. I knew I wanted to commit a year to ministry, and then after that I would start school again. So I actually started grad school the month after we got married. So we got married in August. I started school in September. So I'm back in school. She's finishing up her undergraduate degree, and so we're both students, right? We kind of had a little bit of a plan. How many of us know it's good to have a plan, right? It's also good to know that God will change your plan, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan. Is everybody with me so far? So we had a plan, and that plan was immediately changed because I was really excited. I was like, I'm going to start school, and in order to supplement our income and be able to cover our rent and our expenses and things like that, I would work, a little bit, maybe a part-time job, that kind of thing. And it just so happened that I got a really good job working as a substitute teacher. And then that turned into even more blessing. They offered me a full-time job, and everything was looking really good. And so I'm thinking, man, this was more than I bargained for. This was more than I thought I would have. And I was extremely thankful and blessed by that. And so I'm thinking, all right, cool. I'll just ride this wave into our marriage, and that will help us through these next 4 years, because I knew it was going to take me about 3 or 4 years to finish grad school. And so I'm really excited. I'm thankful. And we get married in August. I started school in September. And then all of a sudden in October of 2007, there was a big hiring freeze within LA Unified School District. And in fact, a lot of brand new teachers who were just hired with credentials, and they went to school to become teachers and all that, were let go during that time. I don't know if people remember that in 2007. And so when that took place, then all of those who had substitute teacher positions no longer had jobs, because the folks with credentials that were that were aiming to be teachers were then being called upon to become the new substitute teachers for the various schools. So my plan immediately fell through. And I remember I was lucky, because for about 3 weeks, a good friend of mine who was one of my assistant principals here at Carson High became a principal of a school out there in that area. Isn't that like God's provision, right? That he's just right down the road. I happen to find out he's there. I go and hang out with him, and he says, hey, I'll do whatever I can to provide you a job here on campus as much as I can. So he gave me about 3 weeks worth of work to show up at Chatsworth High School. And some days I teach in the classroom, and I'm not even kidding. One day he said, hey, I know this isn't like what you went to college for, but honestly, today we need all the lockers to get cleared out in the boys' locker room. So I'm like, all right, cool. I'll get a paycheck. Here we go. So I'm cleaning out all these guys' chonies and nasty socks, right? And their Axe spray and all this kind of stuff, right? And other things I won't mention, right? Putting it in bags, and that was my job for a day. And I just show up again. Hey, you got anything else for me? And yeah, sure. I need you to just sit in the library today. Okay, cool. I'll just go sit in the library. And so finally, after about 3 weeks, he said, hey, I've done what I could, but, I've gotten orders from above. We're not able to offer anything at this point. So it was about a week where I had gotten no phone calls. And a phone call was basically work, right? You get a phone call, that means you get work. And I got no phone calls for a week. And I remember thinking to myself, man, just got married, didn't have a whole lot saved up, right? Really trusting God that God would provide for us. And I got a little bit. You ever get like a little bit nervous, a little bit worried? Of course, I'm not going to talk to Dre about that because I'm embarrassed. And I'm like, I'm a man and we just got married. I just stood in front of everybody in the church and said, I'm going to take care of you. And here I am like, I don't know if I can take care of you. And so immediately, I go and I just start walking around. Our neighborhood, because where we were was right next to the university, and so there's like a Chipotle right there, there's a Vons right there, there's a Starbucks on the corner, and I just started saying, all right, well, it might not be what I wanted to do, but, I'll just go and find something because something's better than nothing. And I came home with about 7 different applications from businesses around the area, just going and saying, hey, do you guys have anything? Are you hiring? Could you use an extra person? I could use about 20 hours of work. If you got that, that'd be awesome. And I come back home, and not even kidding, that very night, that after I had gone around and collected applications to get ready to apply for different jobs, I got a phone call from a guy named Mark Ratcher, who was Josh's boss at the time with Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And Mark Ratcher said, hey, my name's Mark. I think I met you before, but I'm not too sure. You're Josh's brother, right? Yeah. And he says, I heard that you're living in Northridge now. I said, yeah, my wife and I, we just got married and we're living in Northridge. And he says, well, for the past 3 years, I have a small board of folks that have been praying for ministry to happen in the San Fernando Valley, but we just haven't had somebody to go and be on high school campuses doing that kind of ministry. And we heard that, you're called to ministry. Yeah, I have a call to ministry. And you're starting seminary. Yeah, I'm starting seminary. And you're a former athlete. Yeah, I'm a former athlete. And he's like, let's have coffee, So the next morning, we get together over coffee. And the next day, I have a job offer. And didn't have to skip 1 month of rent, right? And in some ways, I felt like, I don't know if this is the way God works, because, we only have access to our interpretation of how we see God working. We don't actually get full access into God's mind most of the time. But what I felt like God was saying to me was, because you weren't above working at you weren't above stocking or doing any kind of things, I opened for you an opportunity, right? And I provided for you a job so that you can help take care of your family during these years. And that was a complete example of the way God provides for me. And I'll never forget that story. And it's a story that shapes us because we always talk about it. And remember when God provided for us and got that phone call like right in the nick of time, right when we were getting ready, rent was going to be due on the 1st. And it had been 3 weeks since I had gotten a job. And just in that moment, the Lord completely opened up a door wide open. I have many more stories like that remind me of God's provision. Do you have stories of God's provision in your life? Of things that He's done in you and for you? And so we make our way here into Genesis, and we're continuing to work our way through this amazing book. Aren't you glad that we've taken our time through the book of Genesis over the last few weeks? For those who have been here, there is so much good stuff in here. It's really hard to run through it. I'm so glad we didn't just say, all right, we're done with Genesis. Let's move on to Exodus, because we have 65 other books of the Bible. But there's so much good stuff in this opening book, this really foundational book of God demonstrating His character to us. And so I want to title this morning, Building a People and Nation for Himself. building a people and nation for himself. This is God's plan. This is what he was up to. And that's why he called Abraham, is because he was setting him apart. He called him out of his father's household in Ur of the Chaldees. And he says, I'm taking you to a new place that I promised to you and your descendants. And Abraham's like, what descendants? I don't have any kids. And I'm already like 90 years old. And God's like, your descendants. I didn't stutter. I said what I said on purpose. How many of us know sometimes it's hard to believe God's promises because of the circumstances around us, but God knows what he's doing. And it might not always seem clear to us, and it might not always make sense to us. In fact, the 2 chapters we're looking at this morning is full of stories that don't make any sense. And sometimes we get so caught up in our own Christianity of thinking that in order for things to be clear, they have to make full sense to us, when in reality, God often works in ways that don't make sense. I had Mark know that I didn't get a phone call for work in 2 weeks, and I had just been collecting applications, but all of a sudden he decides to give me a phone call in that nick of time, right? God's timing. It doesn't make sense, but when God does things in our life, it doesn't often make sense. And so we see here that if we're tracking the story of Genesis, we've been talking about different stories throughout the book, and we notice that we started this new direction or this new relationship between God and Abram that stems all the way back to chapter 12 of Genesis. And that's when God first called him. Now we're in chapters 21 and 22. So we're talking like a 10-chapter span up until we get to this point that we're talking about here today. And notice that one of the things that God promised him back in Genesis chapter 12 was, I will make you a great nation. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And here we are 10 chapters later, and Abraham still doesn't have a child of his own according to the promise. And I don't know about you, but if I'm Abraham, right, my flesh starts getting in the way, and I might start second guessing and questioning whether or not God was true in his promise. Like, Lord, I remember one of the first conversations we had, you said some stuff about these descendants and sand and stars and all this kind of stuff, that they were going to be numerous. But I'm still looking at my wife, Sarah, and I still haven't seen a baby bump just yet. Right? And if you're like Abraham, and sometimes I'm like Abraham, I question God's timing. I question God's timing, and I question the way God does things. But I want you and I to remember today as we go throughout his word that God's timing is perfect and his ways are not our ways. Right? So most of the time God is going to do things in ways that don't make sense to us, that don't work according to our plan, and usually don't work according to our timeline, but it doesn't mean that he's not faithful, and it doesn't mean that he is not going to make true on his promise, make good on his promise. So we need patience with God's timing. Amen? And so part of that is related to a story that is before Genesis 21 and 22, and it's out of Genesis 16. I'm not going to read it. You don't have to turn there. But it's this story of how Abraham and Sarah decided to take matters into their own hands because they weren't satisfied with God's timing. How many of us know we get ourselves in so much trouble when we take matters into our own hands in our time frame rather than trusting that God's timing is best? We start making decisions prematurely. We start going crazy. We start getting desperate and doing things that aren't aligned with God's plan for us because we can't wait, and we're impatient for the things that we've been asking God for, when in reality God is saying, I hear you, just hang on a little bit. I'm working out some things for you, and later on you're going to see why it had to happen that way. But right now it doesn't make sense, and I'm asking you to have faith in me even when it doesn't make sense. Abraham and Sarah, believe it or not, didn't do that. Aren't you glad that there are examples in Scripture of people that mess up? Doesn't that kind of give you a little bit of hope? That you're like, man, okay, if Abraham and Sarah, like Abraham, like the father of faith, man, like he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, and we got all these, so much of our faith is built upon this one man, and yet he made mistakes too. Aren't you thankful that we have that and they didn't scrub that out of the record just to make him look like some perfect individual? No, he had some mistakes. He had some faults. And this is one of those faults where all of a sudden, because he couldn't have children with Sarah, Sarah says to Abraham, go ahead here, sleep with my slave Hagar, and then maybe she can bear you a son, and then you'll be able to fulfill God's promise. When in reality, that was not God's promise. That was Abraham's interpretation of what he thought God's promise was for him. And we make that kind of mistake all the time, man. We make that mistake in our relationships. We make that mistake with our lives, our choices, our decisions. We jump the gun and get ahead of the game because we can't wait for God to come through on his promises. And I want to remind you today, church, have patience in God's promises. Have patience in God's timing, because it's best for us, even if it doesn't make sense for us. So they go, and so, Abraham does what Sarah asked, because it was Sarah's idea. And I was reading through these chapters, and I was just reminded, Sarah had some issues. Like, okay, I'm not trying to get on her because she's a woman or anything. And like I said, Abraham's got some issues too, but Sarah, she is something else. She's what people today would define as cray-cray. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. She's like, okay, Abram, look it. All right, I know that you really want a son. It's not really working with me. So I want you to go ahead and take her, and it's okay. You have my permission, because I want you to be happy. And then all of a sudden she gets pregnant, and then she's mad at her. She's mad at her like, hey, how could you go and get pregnant by my husband? What? What are you saying? Like, what did you do? You're the one, it was your idea, right? And she's like, get out of here. I don't want to see you anymore. Like, literally. I'm paraphrasing, but that's actually what's happening. It's like a soap opera. It's a drama in Genesis 16 and following, right? And Sarah's like, Hagar, I don't want to see your face. So she leaves, but then when she leaves, so here she is, she's an immigrant, right? And she's a slave. Some versions of the Bible say maidservant, but that's really like a euphemism for a slave. And so she's a slave immigrant, okay? And then now she's pregnant, and then all of a sudden, the family that she's part of says, you can't be here no more. So here she is, this the unfortunate young lady who's an immigrant slave who now is disconnected from her source of income, and she's off on her own. Isn't that some crazy stuff there, right? Here's the interesting thing about how God works. Because even in that, we find that in that story, if you read through Genesis 16 and following, you'll see that God shows up to her in the desert and in the wilderness. And isn't that just like our God, to show up to the one person who seems like an outcast, the one person who seems like she's been excluded from community, but God shows up there. What does that mean? That means that in the least likely place, God is there. And with the least likely person, God is there. Right? And in fact, if you think you deserve God's best and blessing and presence, then you're probably on the other end of the spectrum, because God most often shows up to those who don't think they deserve God's blessing. And so God shows up to Hagar. Right? He encourages her. And here's something that's powerful and amazing. You might want to remember this, especially for our women. If you're thinking about how God works with women in the Bible, is in a very rare occasion in Scripture, rather than God giving somebody a name, in that moment, this slave girl named Hagar gives God a name. She says, you are the God who sees me. And they named the well that was right there, Be'er Lahai Roy, which means this is the well of the one who sees me. It's powerful, it's beautiful, this story, that even when we make mistakes where we get ahead of the game and do things that aren't according to God's plan, God is still there. His presence is still there. He still can redeem those situations that seem like they were so outside of God's plan in the beginning. And he redeems that, and he gives her a promise. And he says, hey, you know what? I know you've been treated really terribly, but I have plans for you and your son. Your son's going to be great too. Ishmael. Isn't that something? How good our God is. And so God then has this conversation with her, encourages her. She gives God this name, you are the God who sees me. How many are thankful that we have a God who sees us? Right? He's seen us right now. He's seen you at your lowest point, and he didn't turn away. Right? He's seen all the things. He's seen amazing things, and he's seen the huge mistakes, and he still has not forgotten us. And in fact, it's in those spaces where he's seen us desperate that he comes and he rescues us from those moments. So then in that story, then God encourages her to go back to the family, to Abraham and Sarah. And so she goes back, and so man, now we have some crazy dynamics over here. We got Hagar and her son Ishmael, and Abram and his wife Sarah, and she still can't get pregnant. And so there's a lot of drama that's going on in those chapters in that house. I'm just saying, okay? So for those of you who think like the Bible's all clean and cute and perfect and everything, you just haven't read it enough, okay? You got to get in there, and you'll see that they're just like you and me. But here we get to Genesis 21. And we'll look at this story that takes place there. When you have it, say amen. And of course, our text in the back will have a version of it up on the screens for you to follow along for those who don't have a Bible with you. And it says this in verses 1 and following. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. So we just been talking about that it hadn't been happening according to her timeline or the way she wanted it to happen, but it didn't mean that God was still in the process of fulfilling his promise. So I want you to know right now, I bet you right now, God is fulfilling a promise that he has for you that you're not aware of. And so I want you to trust right now that there are some things that he's working on that you might not be able to see the evidence of that, but that God is currently working on that on your behalf. Okay? And so God is working on that, and it says that he was gracious to Sarah. He was going to do for her what he promised. And then verse 2 says, so Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. So God came through. Somebody say, God came through. God came through. He came through. And he gave Abraham and Sarah a son of their own in his old age. It says he was about 100 years old. Verse 3 continues, Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son that Sarah bore him, which the word Isaac has the word laughter in it because of how laughable this situation was. This old woman giving birth to a son, and this old man being the father to this son. But it was interesting then that they named him Isaac to demonstrate that it's clear that it is pretty ridiculous for them to be having children at this age. And it reminds us that when God does things like that, that sometimes the miracles that God does around us and for us, all we could do is laugh in those situations. I know I do regularly. I see God at work and I just start laughing. People are like, what are you laughing? I'm like, I just see God doing something crazy right now. And that's just like our God, right? But there's a different kind of laughter. It's not a laughter that's mocking. It's more of a laughter that's like so pleased and thankful by God. It's like a joyful laughter of seeing God do things that don't necessarily make sense, right? Has it ever happened to you before? And so Isaac, that's the name that he was given. And verse 4 says, when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. 100 years old. Somebody say 100 years old. So this is just reminder to us that we need to celebrate the miracles of God in our lives. Because this was a miracle, right? That's why she didn't believe it. That's why others didn't believe it. That's why it was a laughable matter, is because it just didn't make sense. But we need to celebrate the miracles that God has done in our lives. The things that are unbelievable, unheard of. Some might even say impossible. God can still and is still doing those things in our lives. Miracles. And that's what faith is built on. Faith is built on trusting and believing that something that doesn't make sense is doable for our God. So we never count God out. And that's essentially where our faith takes us, is if there's a situation that seems, oh man, I don't know if that could happen, that's a good place to start and be reminded that it seems like God is getting ready to do something that God likes to do, which is the impossible. So I want you to think about that right now. As you reflect on this promise to Abram and Sarah and God coming through on that, I want you to think about what are some things in your life right now that might seem impossible surrounding you. Is it that promotion? Is it that new job? Is it a reconciliation of a relationship? Is it getting over something that you've wrestled with for years, maybe even decades? Is it sickness? Think about something right now that seems like it's impossible, and I want you to begin practicing your faith by simply saying, Lord, even though this seems like an impossible situation, I am going to start to practice a faith in you that even in this, you are still able to do something about it. And contrary to what I've seen, heard, or experienced, I'm going to trust that if this is part of your will, it can be done. Right? And that's the faith that we are being called to. That's the faith that Abraham and Sarah, even though they didn't do it perfectly, because like I said, they made mistakes. They went outside of the plan. They tried to do things on their own. But even still, it wasn't like God said, oh, you messed up in Genesis 16, therefore there's not going to be a Genesis 21. Right? Nah, you messed up, man. You already made your choice and you're off of my plan. So therefore, don't expect for me to come and fix all your mess and get you back to where you should be. Sometimes we think like that because we're harder on ourselves than God is on us. We start saying, oh, I don't really deserve a second chance. Maybe somebody else would, but man, I have taken God's second chances and I've thrown those in the trash, so why should he give me a third chance? And what I want to say is this: when we are repentant in our hearts and we come back before God and we recognize and acknowledge that we have sinned and that we have made mistakes and we've taken things into our own hands and we've tried to do things on our own, and we come and we say, Lord, I am genuinely sorry, and I'm turning around from that behavior and that kind of action, and I am now going to learn to trust you even in a better way. How many of you know that his mercies are brand new every single morning and he's willing to walk with us one more time? And I think that's part of what the story is teaching us, that God didn't just say, you messed up, Abraham and Sarah, therefore no Genesis 21 for you. You messed up in your life, therefore those blessings that I know that you heard me tell you that I'm going to provide for you are off the table because you've chosen to do these different things. What I want you to know is this: God doesn't operate like that. That's how we operate as humans, because we are spiteful. And when somebody does something to us, then we say those kinds of things. Forget about you. I want nothing to do with you, right? We're done. Don't even do this. Don't do that. That's how we operate. But God doesn't operate that way. Okay? God doesn't operate that way. And so he gives them another opportunity, and then Genesis 21 tells us that he then finally, miraculously comes through on this crazy, ridiculous promise that he gave to Abram and Sarah. Right? And he comes through in a beautiful way. God, somebody say, God comes through. The important thing in a story like that is to be reminded. I think it's amazing that God did it in this way, because it's a reminder to Abram and Sarah and to every generation after them that only God could do it. That it wasn't something that they could do on their own, that it was physically, scientifically, medically impossible for this thing to take place, but God did it. Somebody say, God did it. And it's important for us to be reminded that as you think about your own salvation, the fact that you have been offered forgiveness and a brand new life, you've been reborn in Jesus, you want to be reminded that you didn't do it because all of a sudden you started to make better choices and live a better life. No, you want to know why that happened? God did it. He sent his son Jesus. He took your sin and my sin upon himself. He got up again in 3 days, conquered sin and death, so that we could live a life that's conquering sin and death. It wasn't you who did it, God did it. As you think about your family and the things that maybe he's done in your family, restoring you, or the process of restoring you and a child, or a child to their parent, or a spouse to a spouse, be reminded that it wasn't just because you went to counseling. Yes, that was good. You should continue to do that. But it was because God did it. Right? When you didn't have a job and you needed a job, and God provided a job for you and gave you what you needed for you and your family, be reminded it wasn't because you went and got 7 applications. God did it. Okay? When your health was going a particular way and you got a word from the doctor and it didn't sound good, and all of a sudden you're walking out and they're looking at you like if you're somebody who shouldn't be walking around, and you could be reminded in that moment, God did it. God did it. Somebody say, God did it. In fact, our families and our children should get tired of hearing us talk about how much God has done for us. Right? They should be like, wait, why do you always say that? It's because it's true. Right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our God. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't for God. Right? Because I almost killed. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Speaking of which, let's move on to chapter 22. So it says, sometime later, verse 1, God tested Abraham. Somebody say, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Okay, now you're like, okay, I thought Sarah was crazy, but God is crazy. I don't know if you've ever been there before, and some of you are like, Pastor Cole, but we can't talk like that. What you talking like that for? I'm just trying to keep it real, okay? Because some of you are like really obedient Christians, and you read that and you're like, oh, this makes total sense, man. God should have called him and told him to sacrifice his son. I get where God's coming from. If that's you, I don't understand you, okay? Because when I read this story, I'm like, what? God? You gave him a promise. You made him wait like 100 years. You come through on the promise, and then you're like, hey, by the way, man, kill your son. It's crazy, is it not? Right? Am I the only one that thinks this story is a little crazy? Right? And Abraham didn't know that it was a test, right? Because if he did, he'd be like, he's probably just testing me right now. Like, right? Like we always read the story with the knowledge of the end. So it allows us to kind of make sense of the beginning part of the story, when in reality, there's nothing that makes sense about the beginning part of the story. Right? Because we think, oh yeah, he's going to be up there ready with the dagger, and then all of a sudden, God's going to intervene. Abraham didn't know that. All he heard was God say, go, take your son, sacrifice him. And I'd have been like, no. I mean, I don't know about you, right? I'd have been like, that's probably not God speaking to me. It's probably just the devil, or like, I'm probably feeling guilty about receiving this like blessing this late in life, and so maybe that's like my inner, ego that's telling me to do these things. It's probably not God. Never mind. Forget about it. But God says, Abraham, take your son, right? Abraham says, here I am. And then we see in verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up and he loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in a distance. And he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. So Abraham's like on board with this challenge, or whatever it's called, that God gives him. And he's taking his son out there to sacrifice him. And he gets the wood ready and everything. Abraham obeyed even though it didn't make sense to him. And that's where I think I want to focus our thoughts on this particular passage. Abraham obeyed God even when it didn't make sense to him. And that's a word to me, because I often want things to make sense to me. Like I start negotiating with God. Lord, I'm trying to put things together, and the math just doesn't add up. And God's just like, just trust me, okay? And I'm like, I will, but you're going to have to explain a little bit more, God, about how these things. And finally, God's just like, haven't you realized by now that I don't need to explain everything to you in order for you to obey me, right? And so Abraham obeys God, even though it didn't make sense to him. Isaac asked him a very, good question. He's like, hey, Dad, we came out here, and the 2 guys helped us get here. I see the wood, and I noticed that you have a knife. But typically when a sacrifice happens, you need like an animal, like a lamb or something like that. Where's the animal, Dad? Right? And Abraham says to his son, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. But then he proceeds to tie him up in a rope. Okay. Okay, ready? When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, and he bound his son Isaac and he laid him on the altar. And I just can imagine, like, what's going on? Like, Isaac's just looking at him, like, imagine like the look on his face. Like, there's probably an emoji for that, Like, I'm really sad and confused right now. And he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. Okay, by the way, most of us know how this story ends, right? But Abraham and Isaac didn't. All I'm saying is he probably had PTSD. But nevertheless, let's continue forward. Right? I mean, imagine. Okay. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven. Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now that I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up, and right there in a thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram, and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. God provided. God tested him. It does kind of remind me of Jesus' teaching to the disciples that also seemed a little bit counterintuitive when he would tell them, if you want to save your life, you got to lose it. Right? If you want to find your life, then you got to give it up. And that's this paradoxical things that don't initially make sense. But in reality, the more we sit with it in our spirit and in our soul, we can really understand what that means. That oftentimes in our lives, it's the moment we let go of something that we truly have it. It's the moment that we say, Lord, here it is, it's yours. And God's like, perfect, I got you right where I want you. Here you go. Now I'm going to start doing things that I've been wanting to do all this time, but I had to see whether or not I could trust you with it. See, I think too often we ask God for things in our lives and God's like, you can't even handle that. Why am I going to give it to you, right? It's like when I asked my dad for the Corvette Stingray that my neighbor had just refurbished, and I was 16 years old, and my dad was tempted, and finally he said, you'll kill yourself in it, you're not getting it. So he gave me, what was it, a Chrysler, it was a jacked up van that I drove for a while. Anyway, it wasn't a Corvette Stingray, because my dad's like, you don't know what to do with that fifth gear. Like, you're going to be in a tree somewhere, right? In that fifth gear, right? But we often ask God, Lord, I want this and I want that and I want the other. And God's like, you wouldn't know what to do with that. If I gave you all that, you'd become prideful. You'd become arrogant. You think you're better than people. You won't be a vessel of blessing and an outpouring and outflowing. So why am I going to pour things into you when I know you're just going to dam it up for yourself? You ain't ready for it yet because you're not even giving anybody with what you have right now. So why would I give you more than what you currently have? Right? And God's like, I want to see you be faithful with the little things so then I can entrust you with much. I want to see you look at what you do have and say, Lord, here it is. It's yours. I'm not going to use it for my own glory or for my own honor or for my own my own well-being. But Lord, I'm going to take everything that I have. And God, it truly is yours. Then God will say, cool, I got you where I want you. Here you go. I'm going to throw a couple more things in there. I'm going to throw a couple more this or that, or I'm going to give you this relationship that you've been asking for. But right now, you haven't been able to handle the relationships you have currently, so why am I going to give you this one? Right? And so we have to be reminded here in this passage that this test, although it doesn't make sense to me or to many of us, God is essentially saying, I need to know that even this blessing that I gave you is not going to become your God. Right? I need to know, Abraham, that the son that I've given you, which is a blessing, doesn't become an idol for you to worship. And all of a sudden you don't need me anymore because you've only needed me to get you to this point. And I want to have this continual relationship with you. And therefore this act was a symbolic reminder that Abraham was ready to say, Lord, even this that I've been waiting so long for, even this is yours. My son is yours. Right? My life is yours. My time is yours. My energy is yours. Everything that you've given me is yours. And when Abram was able to do that, God came and provided, and we are reminded then that from that point forward, we have the God who provides. The God who provides for us. And he provides for us when he is convinced that the thing he's providing won't replace him as an object of worship. Right? He provides for us when he knows that we can handle that blessing. And so this morning I want you to think to yourself, Lord, what do you want to do in my life so that I can demonstrate that I can handle the blessings that you want to give to me? Maybe there's somebody here this morning and you're just in a spot where you really could use God's provision. And maybe that's financially, maybe that's in health, maybe that's in relationships or whatever that looks like. And I want to encourage you to be reminded that our God can do impossible things, and he is the God who provides. He is the God who provides. Watch this promise that the Lord gives to Abraham after this passage. In verse 15 of chapter 22, it says, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me.